Hello and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're looking at the 6th encounter in the Eternal Palace, the Queen's Court.
So this encounter consists of 2 bosses with separate health pools and different abilities and mechanics that you have to counter. To add, Queen Azshara will ask you to perform certain actions throughout the fight, which have various negative effects if you fail to execute them. Anyway, let's start off by explaining the core boss mechanics.
So tanks need to keep the bosses spread at all times. If they remain within 21 yards of each other, they both take 99% less damage. After all of our testing, we believe tanking Silavaz in the middle of the room and Pashmar on the outsides is likely to be the best formation to try and maintain in order to deal with the majority of abilities. Tanks will need to perform swaps on these 2 bosses throughout the fight, as Silavaz gains a stacking attack speed increase that is only reset when he attacks a new target, and Pashmar applies a stacking debuff that will mind control you once it reaches 10 stacks. We decided to normally swap around the 8 stack mark. Now for the raid to keep an eye on is Silavaz's charge. He'll target a random player and after 6 seconds he'll charge towards them and hit them for a lethal amount of frost damage. This however is split between all players within 8 yards, so you'll want to stack up on that target to help spread the damage. Now this will also spawn a puddle on the ground that lasts a pretty long time, dealing ticking damage to anyone who stood within it. So when you're targeted you want to move to the edges of the room and others should follow you to make sure that you actually survive when you're charged. Now when Silavaz reaches max energy he'll cast Zealous Eruption. This creates a large zone around him as he begins to deal large ticking damage to the raid. If you're stood within the targeting circle you take no damage whatsoever. So as the cast starts you want to make sure you're within the circle beforehand.
As for Pashmar, she'll debuff players with Fanatical Verdict. This debuff deals a moderate amount of damage to you and any players within 5 yards when it expires, so you've got to make sure that you move away from others before it times out. She'll also spawn a set of orbs on a timer. These orbs always spawn in the exact same locations and slowly lose health. When they eventually die, they'll deal a large amount of burst damage to the entire raid, also debuffing you, increasing the damage you take from these orb explosions for 5 seconds. So in high botanist fashion, you'll want to nuke down a single orb immediately, wait for the debuff to drop, and then nuke the second, and then completely ignore the last one, letting it explode by itself well after your debuff has dropped for a second time. And last to mention, Pashmar at full energy will cast Violent Outburst. This deals large damage to all raid members at the end of the cast, however this is significantly reduced by moving away from the boss, which is achieved pretty much passively by tanking her away from the raid. With her stood far away from the raid, you will want your ranged DPS to focus her down, while primarily the melee focus on Silavaz. You do however need to keep a very close eye on boss health throughout the fight, as when the bosses reach 1 health they'll begin a long cast that will heal them for a shitload, and this is only interrupted when both bosses are killed at the same time, so DPS will have to swap throughout the fight just to make sure that heal never goes through. But that's all of the boss's mechanics. We do however have Queen Azshara being a nuisance with her decrees.
So this ability is cast on a timer, forcing you to deal with 1 of 5 decrees. The order you need to deal with them does seem to be set, however in one of the earlier tests it was completely random. All that we do know for certain is that it doesn't seem possible to get the same one twice in a row. Let's have a look at these. So form ranks causes multiple circles to appear in the room. If these circles aren't quickly stood within, they'll explode, dealing massive raid-wide damage. These are typically spawned towards the middle of the room, usually very close to one another. This also overlaps with Silavaz's Zealous Eruption cast, which is why tanking him in the middle of the room is a pretty good idea. Another one you'll get is Repeat Performance. This debuff is applied to the entire raid for 30 seconds. All it simply does is silence and pacify you whenever you cast the same ability twice. So you pretty much just gotta pretend that you're a Windwalker monk until the debuff drops. You've also got the Stand Alone decree. Surprisingly, it just asks you to stand alone, away from any other players. If you do get too close to others, you'll both just start taking bursts of damage. This on some of our tests also overlapped with horrible points, such as when you want to stack up for someone getting charged, and again for Silavaz's Zealous Eruption cast when you want to be inside of his bubble. Now as for the Deferred Sentence, it asks of you to move. Whilst you stand still, you'll just gain a stacking debuff. This debuff itself doesn't do anything, however at the end of the decree, 30 seconds after it initially came in, all of your stacks will just simply explode, dealing a shit ton of damage to you. Fortunately, you can keep your stacks under control by moving. Each time you move, your stacks will reset and you'll just take a small amount of damage per stack you just removed. So we found keeping your stacks around the 3 or 4 stack mark at most was safest. Finally, the Obey or Suffer decree. This makes it so whenever you take damage, you'll become healing immune for 5 seconds. Now this sounds absolutely terrifying if you're a tank, however when the healing immunity drops, you can't gain it again, or at least it doesn't seem that you can, for at least another 5 seconds, allowing healers to top you up in between healing immunities. As for everyone else, not a whole lot changes, just don't take damage regularly so your healers can keep you topped up. But that's it for all the abilities and mechanics in play for the fight on normal and heroic difficulty, and for live it really does seem that the only significant points for you to progress through will be overlaps with decrees and other abilities directly from the bosses. Aside from that, it's all very simple and pretty easy to counter as long as you're paying attention. As for the mythic version of the encounter, it's a pretty large step up. Each decree will emanate an aura around one of the structures in the room, covering a large section, preventing people from standing in it basically. And this will slowly rotate around the room, covering a new structure each time a new decree comes in. And on Mythic, these come in fast, there's absolutely no downtime whatsoever. And they overlap with pretty much every ability that the bosses have, forcing you to learn every single overlap. These overlaps also have different timers or spell orders as the fight goes on, which also means you need to deal with them slightly differently each time. But anyway, with all of our PTR previews, what do we think of this encounter?
Well, I think maybe the normal and heroic version of the fight is maybe a bit bland. The amount of overlaps with max energy abilities could probably be increased, so it's slightly similar to Mythic, but then you can just tune it in such a way so that it is okay if you don't necessarily execute it perfectly every single time. You know, dealing with very basic mechanics such as move out and soak the charge, move out with a verdict, stand in Silivaz's circle and move away from Pashmar's circle with nothing else going on the majority of the time is just kind of boring. The fight only really becomes exciting when you also have decrees to deal with at the exact same time. That while testing on heroic, the very first test, we didn't really see much of.
But on the later test, which was on normal and mythic difficulty, it did seem that they tried to increase the amount that you would see the decrees. Of course, on mythic it was all the time, whereas on normal mode, there's only a 30-second gap in between each one, and they last 30 seconds long each, give or take. So, you know, it did make it so they were quite a key part of the fight. And as you said, those parts of the fight are interesting, especially when you get standalone and, you know, soak the guy. Because you're like, how are we going to deal with this? Are we just going to throw a bunch of shields on that guy? Like, everyone void stone the poor fella and try and save him? Or are we just going to quickly stack up and, like, fuck the decree, we have to try and save the guy? Which probably is the right thing to do, but, you know, it's a little bit of a decision that you get to make, which is kind of where the interesting parts of this fight lie. But aside from the one issue where sometimes the downtime can be a little bit boring, it's overall a very solid encounter and did feel polished. And again, we probably already made it clear, on Mythic it is very, very cool.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see what comps are going to be used for this, for guilds that are going to be going in on Mythic difficulty, because especially if it's tightly tuned, the fact that you have to have the bosses spread apart and they do need to die within a similar time period, you're just going to see a bunch of, you know why Shadow's been nerfed now. Warlocks as well, loads of multi-dots, and it really wouldn't surprise me that if this fight is difficult, you're going to really see a massive drop in some of the melee DPS that just can't cleave between these two mobs, which I think is so unnecessary. I think it would be better if the bosses could be stacked and you have to constantly think about dragging them apart from one another depending on their special abilities, and that way you can actually bring melee DPS without feeling like, oh, we should bring a Shadow or whatever. It doesn't matter, just bring them all in. Why not? Why not just allow them to be stacked? Give them more health if you want the fight to last longer.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I mean, also the thing with the fight, especially on Mythic, I know we keep going back to Mythic over and over again, but I think that's the one that we're, you know, most enthusiastic about. Large personal damage reductions are very important on this fight as well. The ability to cheese some of the charges. If you have enough damage reductions up, and again, like you said, Void Stones, not having to soak at set points is going to be vital.
Yeah, it's going to be really useful.
Having certain people that can stand out of those circles, because you know the entire raid has standalone and there's not enough space within the circle for everyone to stand in. Maybe you're going to want some people standing out using personals instead. And what classes have really good personals, like massive ones? Shadow Priest, Warlock.
Oh god.
So
yeah, we're already going to be bringing like if it's difficult, like in terms of damage, all you do is just bring all those classes, which sucks. Like we already saw that in Restless Cabal, and those bosses could already be stacked. Imagine Restless Cabal where you had to spread the bosses apart.
Yeah.
And that's what this boss is going to be in terms of class balance. Either way, that's where we're going to leave it today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this preview, then do show us some love by hitting us with a like. And before we do go, if you'd like to keep updated with this encounter, then do go and check out our guides over on Wowhead. Whenever encounters are changed or new strategies are formed, you'll be able to keep in the loop over there, so do go and check it out. And of course, we will have an updated live guide for you guys sometime next week. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you all in the next one.
Thanks for watching.